friends, and welcome to part 4 in our series, Good Grief. A really critical week as we talk about what it looks like to go alongside of those who are grieving. And I want to again just say, I'm sorry if you weren't able to be in person as we had this message shared in person on a Sunday morning. It's always better to be in the building, but I'm glad that you're watching this anyway. I want to start with a story, personal story. And most of the time when I share a personal story from my own life, it's usually where I'm not the good guy, or I did it right, or something like that. I don't want to further a sense of pastors being perfect and all that. So I usually just share stories where I maybe messed up. But sometimes I can't help but share my success stories. So back a number of years ago, when Madeline and I were just still dating, and I was getting to know her and her story and all that, I had taken her down to the river, the Rappahannock right here in Fredericksburg, and we were talking, and we ended up having a really serious conversation. Madeline started opening up and sharing with me about some really heavy and personal and profound grief, some trauma that she had gone through in her life. And as she's in the midst of sharing this with literal tears coming out of her eyes, all of a sudden I saw over her shoulder that an osprey had all of a sudden dove into the water and was coming up with a fish in its talons. It was epic to watch. And so I was just like, hey, sorry, but like, did you see that? That was so cool. And just about every Christmas since, my now wife has gone ahead and given me some kind of bird-related gift, whether it's a calendar or a DVD or something of that nature, because obviously she's assured that I must really, really love birds to have thought that it was worth pointing out at that moment while she's sharing with tears in her eyes about a bird that was getting a fish. So maybe I didn't handle that one great. But honestly, I do believe I'm getting better at this, which I know it's a low bar, but I think I'm getting better. And that's all we can really ask for and hope for, is getting better. Now, please don't think that I'm meaning by saying that, like, it's no big deal what we're talking about when it comes to this. But I'm just saying that improvement is really something we've just got to keep on striving for, to get better and coming alongside people who are grieving. I'm hoping that I get better in this, and I'm hoping that the people that I get to pastor, here at Alive, I hope we get better at this, because hear me out. It's an area where the stakes couldn't be much higher. I mean, just think of this. How many times in your life has the right thing been said or been done when you've been hurting, and it just means the world? It just means so much to you that they said or did the right thing. Can you think of some examples in your life where they did it right? Now, how many times, though, has the wrong thing been said or been done? I saw this card in a book that I was reading for this series, and I thought, oh, what a perfect demonstration of exactly what we need to realize is just so painful. And maybe you've experienced some of those painful things when someone just said or did the wrong things. Now, emotionally then, the stakes are high. But I want you to understand, spiritually, they are high too. Look at what Paul says in Galatians 6, verse 2. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Let's hold on to that for a second. Did you know that the word grief comes from actually the old French word that goes ahead and actually means burden? So a grief is a burden that person is carrying. And so Paul tells us by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. The law of Christ, what Jesus said, hey, here's what the greatest thing is. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Paul's writing that helping bear each other's burdens, carrying their grief with them, is a way that you and I can fulfill or accomplish the law of Christ, the greatest desire of Jesus, what he is after and wanting. It's the way, it's how you and I win. And it makes sense because caring for someone in their suffering and in their sorrow is one of the greatest opportunities, isn't it? To demonstrate real, practical love. Love doesn't just join me in my successes, though it does that too, and that's important. But it also is willing to stoop to my lowly state as well. And when Job, who we talked about last week, was at his lowest state, his heart yearned for just some godly comfort. And the friends that he had in that moment, they dropped the ball. They didn't bring godly comfort. They left him saying in chapter 6, "He who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty." Because he saw it, you fear God, you respect God, well then you're going to want to be particularly kind to someone who's hurting. Now, if you missed our kindness series that we did a couple months ago here in 2021, one of my favorite series we've done, kindness, we got into it, and I would recommend if you weren't there for this series, you weren't part of a live, or maybe you missed it, go back and watch it this week, because we realized in that series that kindness is more than niceness. It is not just niceness. It's a powerful work of caring in really practical ways for others. It's going above and beyond. Kindness isn't free, for instance. We talked about that in one of the messages. Kindness is how we take the unbelievable love that God has for us and we show it in mighty ways to others. What a better way to do that, to really be truly kind than when someone is grieving. I want to share with you a main passage for us today in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Listen to what Paul says here. He says, Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. So God offers us comfort, right? And it's important, just so you know, that we receive that as a first step. Like, you can't give away what you don't have. If you want to give away the ultimate comfort and peace, then you need to have that peace in Jesus. You need to really know that you're in close relationship with him and receive that. But Paul also here saw that comfort, and that's something we receive, as something that exists so that we can then comfort others. Like, it's a care that leads to comfort. We see their burden as something that we're called to help them bear. Romans 12:15 says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn." So the Bible recognizes this idea of grief. It's meant to be done in community, not by yourself. Otherwise, if we're doing it on our own, if we're bearing it on our own, we often feel stuck, feeling like we need to handle this all on our own and there's no help for us. But when Jesus called his church to be his hands and his feet in the world, don't you think that maybe, just maybe, that those feet should be walking alongside the person on their path of pain? And that maybe that hand should be on the shoulder of a person whose life feels like it's just a crushing weight. I want to help us today in very practical ways. If you're a note taker, you're going to love today, because there's going to be very practical ways that you and I can figure out some ways to be great burden bearers. We're going to carry some weights for some people. We're going to come alongside of them in their grieving, and we're going to show them the love and the comfort that we have in Jesus in ways that will hopefully help them. Now, speaking of help, I want to have some helpful, realistic expectations before we get started here, just real quickly. One is that no one's arrived. You'll always have room to improve, and also, I'm no expert. So let's just set those standards right off the bat. But that means that we're going to learn together here, okay? And then also, I'm sure you've heard this a million times, but just it's worth repeating that everybody grieves differently, and that's okay. It's totally okay that people grieve differently. And it's important to really get that people are nuanced and different. So while something might very well be meaningful to you, it may be not as meaningful to someone else. What matters to you, what you would want, may not be what someone else would want. So what we talk about today, I hope you understand, are going to be some principles. Not guarantees, but principles that I really do think that have some principled truth to them. And it would be silly if we approach grief with just sheer logic. Like, this is the way it always works every time. Like you and I all process grief purely logically, right? I mean, C.S. Lewis, when he went through the grief of losing his wife and she had died, he wrote, actually under a different name because he was going to be saying some really tough things, but he wrote a book called A Grief Observed, and he said this: "At work, at the club, in the street, I see people, as they approach me, trying to make up their minds whether they'll say something about it," his wife passing away, "or not. I hate it if they do, and if they don't." See, that's what the logic that I'm talking about here. But look at what else he says. "Her absence is like the sky spread over everything." For a person who's grieving, it often feels all-encompassing like that. The loss, the things that are no longer in their hands, they keep on reaching out for. It's all-encompassing. So you and I may feel then in that moment, if we're trying to come alongside of them, what help can I possibly offer when it's that big? And my answer to you to that question is probably more than you could imagine. If you do it right, you can probably help more than you could even imagine. But let me tell you, before we get started, one more thing. You better deal with your insecurities that you may have if you're going to help somebody. Because if you feel uncomfortable with sad and heavy things, for whatever reason you feel uncomfortable going there and talking about that, you feel the need to change the subject a lot or to make jokes to kind of make light of it, it's not going to help. It's going to maybe probably do more hurt and harm than help. So you and I, we got to learn to pray to God. Invite him. He's the God of all comfort. He is the one who knows that person and knows how to go ahead and work in their lives. Got to ask God to help us as we help others and then lean into practical wisdom. We'll make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. But we can definitely avoid some of the mistakes and hopefully offer some real help because the stakes, like I said earlier, are super high. So are you ready? Let's jump in. The first thing that we can do is to empathize. And I know that's pretty basic, but let's really dig into it. As I was studying, the word empathize simply means to understand and share the feelings of another. And I just want to be clear, real quick and real important. We're not looking to get to the point where you can or should say, oh, I know what you're going through. That's not what it means to understand. Don't say that, like practically ever. Because that's making their pain about you and about your experience and all that. And it's probably not true. And we're going to get more into that whole thing later, but just that's a no-no. Don't do it. But empathy, real empathy, is actually quite the opposite. It's making it about them and what they're going through and seeking to understand and even share the feelings that they're feeling, putting yourself in their shoes. This is even biblical. Check it out. Hebrews 13 says, remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated since you are also in the body. Paul, this hard-nosed guy sometimes, he can be so like, just, this is what is. He even demonstrated this idea of like gentle empathy, coming alongside and feeling the pain of others. In 2 Corinthians 11, after verses and verses of him talking about the struggles that he'd faced. I mean, these are major league struggles. He's talking about his beatings that he's had to endure, unfair imprisonments and really rough conditions, and then literally being shipwrecked multiple times. And he's talking about all this, and he says, yet suddenly he shifts the topic and goes, and on top of all that, I've just had such a weight on my shoulders of concern for the churches that I've started and the people that are in those churches. Like there's just such a care and compassion. Look at what he says though in verse 29. He says, like, who is weak without my feeling that weakness? Who is led astray and I do not burn with anger? He's talking about feeling what they're feeling, caring about what they're caring about. Again, grief is meant to be done, as we can see here, in community. It's a relational experience. And I wonder if maybe that's why God put our tear ducts in our eyes, because our pain is being portrayed eye to eye with another person. We communicate and are understood through that window of the soul, you know? So we should take seriously the pain that people are going through, even if, maybe especially when we really struggle to understand it ourselves. We don't know what it's like. That's a chance for us to grow, for us to learn what it's like. Maybe we find it important in those moments to confess that we don't understand, but we'd like to. We'd like to try to understand. We can honor their struggle by sharing in the struggle with them. Here's again, real practical today. Here's something that might be helpful to simply say in those moments, if you're going to say anything. To empathize with them, you can say, thank you for sharing your pain with me. My heart hurts for you. Thank you for sharing that. Allows them to feel like it wasn't a burden to you. Thank you for sharing that with me. My heart hurts for you. And as we have studied this Good Grief series together over these last couple weeks, maybe you can use some of that knowledge even to help you empathize. You don't want to assume, but you might be, because of this series, and what we talked about 2 weeks ago, you might be clued into those feelings of fear and helplessness that they're maybe dealing with. Or you might commiserate better with the questions that they have about why is this going on in their life. Or you might empathize with their feelings of guilt that they have, that maybe it's their responsibility, their fault, whatever it might be. One, again, real practical thing here about just specifically empathize as an action step that I've learned from my experience personally being in therapy is the idea of mirroring. And mirroring is a way that you just tune in to what their body is doing so that it's a weird thing, because even subconsciously, we start to feel heard and understood. Have you ever noticed that? Like when somebody's like nodding as they're sharing and the other person's nodding along, it kind of has that sense of like, okay, you get this. Or like, the other day I was sharing a story with a friend of mine and I got really wide-eyed and I was just like this. And I watched as he was like, kind of like, wow, that's incredible. He went wide-eyed with me. And it made me feel more heard than if he'd been like, wow, that's incredible. Like, wow, that's crazy. He mirrored my body language and it made me feel heard. So that's a real practical thing you can do. When it comes to empathizing, just realize this. When someone who is weak knows that someone else cares, they begin gaining new strength just because someone cares. Now, on top of empathizing, another way that you can bear another person's burdens and their griefs is to simply be with. Let's be honest. We can often be anxious about how to best help someone who's hurting, can't we? Like, y'all know that helpless sense that you have feeling around people that are in pain. Like, it's awkward sometimes of like, wow, that pain is so intense. I don't know what I'm going to say or what I can do. And not just helpless. Sometimes we even feel so far as like guilty. Like, because we feel guilty and bad. Like, nothing I'm going to say, nothing I could say is going to end up taking this pain away. In fact, we can feel like everything we say feels about as natural and eloquent as like a middle schooler reciting lines for a school play. It just doesn't feel like it's doing any good. I hope that maybe that reality gives you a really good assurance that the fact is true that often presence is more valuable than eloquence. The Jewish tradition has, when someone dies in a family or a friend or something like that, people will do this thing called sitting Shiva. It's Shiva, which is coming alongside and just being with somebody in their home. They literally will invite themselves into homes of people, and not to be an extra burden, but just so that person isn't alone. So that a wife who's grieving maybe her husband's death, or a dad who's grieving his son's death, or whatever it might be, isn't doing it alone. Like, they'll just come and sometimes even bring their chores with them, and they'll do their work and they'll just be there with them. In fact, this is still a tradition in the Middle East because just 2 weeks ago, I think it was, we had an incredible family come and visit a live church, share in our Sunday gathering in our building about Oscar's dad who had passed away, and the way that the community came around and just stayed with them as they mourned that loss. See, because even just sitting silently with someone can be a great gift. I mean, think of the fact we talked 2 weeks ago about that sense of fear and helplessness. That feeds off of loneliness. So community can help wither it away if we come alongside. And at the very least, it lets the person know that they're cared about, that people care and notice. Job, going back to that story, it starts off early on. It says that now when Job's 3 friends, after all the disaster had gone on, they heard of all this evil that had come upon him. They came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept. And they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven. They're mourning with him. And then they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Now, as much as we can give these guys a hard time, and we will, literally today, because they earn it. But this much, at least, they did absolutely right. They noticed his suffering was very great, so they just sat and mourned with him. There's an immense power in being with someone in their grief. And the terrible irony of it, that maybe, I hope not, but maybe you've experienced even, the terrible irony is that sometimes those who are going through grief get left alone because people simply don't know what to say or do, so they just leave them alone. It's not helpful. That's when that person probably most needs community around them. So they may not need anything said or done, just to have someone with them as they grieve. Thirdly, though, be willing to process their pain with them. I say willing because it's not something that you want to force. You don't want to make them process it, but be willing to. It's so valuable to be available to process their pain with, maybe even inviting that conversation. And it doesn't matter, just so you know, if you've gone through a similar situation or if you haven't. So sometimes we disqualify ourselves and we say things like, well, I've never dealt with anything like that before. I don't know what they're going through. Okay, fine. Well, then just humbly ask them and listen. Let them tell you what it's like. Because even if you had gone through the situation, you might not be processing it the same way they are, right? Just because you haven't experienced the pain someone else has experienced doesn't mean it wouldn't be deeply meaningful for you to come alongside them in their grieving. And here's a tip. It's actually helpful as you're going to ask questions maybe to help them process. Or if you ever see somebody who's grieving and you know they're going through a loss or a hard time, one of the helpful ways you can ask is, hey, how are you today? Not just like, hey, how are you doing? Don't you always feel bad asking that anyway to somebody you know has experienced significant loss? But if you say, how are you doing today, it helps them to think about not, the sea of, but it just can kind of like, today I'm feeling, or like, how are you feeling right now? Hey, if you don't mind my asking, how are you feeling now? It narrows it down. It helps them to be able to communicate a more manageable piece of all that they're feeling. And I understand, just so you know, I understand it can be scary to ask questions. But most often, a few questions, not bombarding them, but a few questions can be actually really helpful. We can have a concern that works against us when it comes to this. Like, well, if I ask questions, like, what if I end up reopening the wound, you know? Listen, their dad died, the wound isn't closed, or whatever it might be. The chances are good that most wounds aren't as closed as people think. So we're thinking we're reopening the wound. We're not. If anything, grieving people can feel like people not asking them about it or intentionally avoiding it, etc., can make them feel like everyone's thinking they should have moved on by now and shouldn't be still affected by it. That's why the gift of a listening ear can be so good for the hurting heart. Now get this, good listening, just good listening, is more powerful, far more powerful than really good speaking. Just being a good listener. In fact, as they're processing their pain, our speaking can often come from our desire to fix their situation. But that's not what is often needed or wanted or even good. Nope. Just lean into the hurt that they're feeling. And don't change the subject just because it's hard. Yes, talking about it with them, asking them questions, it might bring tears. But tears aren't the enemy here, okay? Hear me out. Unprocessed pain is. Leaving them to bear their grief on their own is. So let's not do that. All right. Fourthly, I think here, take it slow. Now, a lot of times, bad things happen when we speed too quickly through the grieving process, both when we're the one grieving and when we're walking alongside someone else who is doing that. This is not a microwave moment. No quick fixes or magical statements that suddenly make everything okay? So we're going to need patience. Like, that's one of the fruit of the Spirit, right? Patience. Remember how God says that, we should be slow to speak? Well, this may be one of the most important times to practice that. Seriously, like quite literally, if I can be so bold, some of us, we need to get more comfortable with awkward pauses. As we're talking with somebody and it just feels like, do I say it? Because when we rush to respond, it almost intuitively devalues the weightiness of the moment for them. Because look at that. You already know what to say to this incredibly deep and profound pain that they're going through. Don't respond right away. Feel it first. Go slow. Now, another reason that we should be careful to take it slow is that we can sometimes try to move that person past their pain too fast. So we're moving fast because we want to move them past their pain too fast. Don't you love when you're hurting and like genuinely, and then someone tries to get you just to be happy? Like, oh, come on, let's just move past it. And like you're not ready to move past it. You have to process it first, and they're just like, Scripture talks about this. In Proverbs 25, it says, singing cheerful songs to a person with a heavy heart is like taking someone's coat in the cold weather or pouring vinegar in a wound. This is kind of where we get that common phrase of like pouring salt on the wound. The Bible says that this is not a good idea to try and like speed someone through it. In fact, I would even want to point us to another passage of wisdom literature from the scriptures in Ecclesiastes, where it's written, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." So hear me out. Let the mourning, let the grieving have its time. Now, I want to shift gears here for a quick minute, and I want to give some general warning specifically around this one topic of like, be really cautious and careful what you say. So we're going to dig into this a little bit here. Because since the stakes are so high, what we say carries that much more weight. And it can be good, but it can also be bad then because of that. So here's the first thing underneath being careful and cautious of what we say. Realize the wrong words are often more damaging than the right words are healing. I mean, I'm sure you probably have heard the statistic that talks about how there's this many positive things that you need to say in order to offset one negative thing. Have you heard this statistic before? Well, as we look at this whole idea of talking with someone who's grieving, there's a relief we should hopefully hear here when it comes to this idea that like our damaging words could be more damaging than our helping words could be. There's a low expectation then for you on how healing your words need to be. Don't worry about it. See, just be careful that you don't say anything stupid as best you can. Job's friends did well for Job to just come by and just sit with him. They messed up once they spoke up. And that's what led Job then to go ahead and call him out and say, "As for you, you whitewash with lies. Worthless physicians are you all. Oh, that you would keep silent, and it would be your wisdom." See, there's some stupid things that people say that get us to want to call people worthless physicians. Like the person who looks at somebody and says, "Well, God must have loved your daughter very much to take her so soon." Well, one, there's not an ounce of scriptural grounding for this kind of theology of suffering at all. And two, that leaves that person wishing that God didn't love their daughter quite so much. It's not helpful. Another thing that people will say that is wrong and hurtful, God won't give you more than you can handle. One, again with the bad theology here, but two, it leaves the hurting person feeling less comforted and more so feeling like God's punishing them for having as much faith as they had. Honestly, sometimes these bedside consolations can cause more pain than there was before that. So when people are facing incredible pain and suffering, believe it or not, they don't need Christian cliches. They just need an actual loving Christian. And perhaps one of the greatest gifts we can give as the body of Christ to that person in that moment is to keep them from having to suffer for the wrong reasons. Another thing here, it's dangerous and often dumb to assign meaning to their pain. This is where Job's friends messed up the biggest. They thought, "Oh, you must have sinned," and they told him so. "You must have sinned. That's why they assigned that meaning to his pain." But after God's talk with Job, which we kind of talked about last week, he then turns and says Eliphaz and his two friends are idiots, basically. He has them apologize to Job and go back, and Job has to pray for them so that God will forgive them. This is what God says to them. He says to Eliphaz, "For you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has." So yeah, not good to assign blame. And also not good, if I can just reiterate my comment about cliches here, for you to say things like, "Well, everything happens for a reason." Don't do that. Don't do that. All right, lastly here, unsolicited advice is often about as helpful as hemorrhoids. I know I'm being kind of funny, but it's seriously a pain in the butt when you're hurting and someone starts telling you about what you could have done that would have kept you from getting into that pain, or maybe step by step, so what they think you should do now. Listen, y'all, Romans 12:15, which we read earlier, said, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn," not rejoice with those who rejoice and mentor those who mourn. Now again, there's a time for everything, season for everything under the sun, which we just read in Ecclesiastes, so maybe there is a time for advice. But most often, it's the time after it's been invited by that person. When you're bearing someone's burdens with them, they don't need advice as much as they need empathy and care, love. And don't worry, sometimes love does get hands-on. So let's talk about the final thing that you should do. Let's go back to the earlier list, and let's talk about the final thing we should do. Offer tangible help. Like at Alive, we've done this a lot over the last number of years that we've been at church, whether it's a meal train or we've had people help around the house of somebody who's going through some grief, or maybe helping them with their hospital documents, sorting through all of that, or even helping pay those bills, things like that. There's a lot that you can do, to come alongside somebody and offer tangible help. And yet there's some things that you should know that I want to make sure you understand when it comes to this particular topic that'll be helping us to be more helpful than not. Here it is. When offering help, don't say, hey, if there's anything you need, I'm here. Let me know if you need anything, kind of stuff like that. Because it's sweet to offer such a catch-all of, if you need anything, just let me know. But at that point, when you do that, who's carrying the responsibility of determining the things that need done? Them, right? It ends up putting the weight back on that person's shoulders to go ahead and ask, think of it, ask, and then tell you what they need and how it needs to be done. Like, instead, what if you said something like, would it help you if I, and you offer a suggestion? This puts the burden of coming up with a task that would help them on you, not on their already weary shoulders. And you can give them a list of options. You can say, would it help you if I did this, or none of those? Personally, I can't tell you how true this is. Just, again, I'm making sure that you understand this isn't theoretical. I'm so grateful for people who've cared enough to offer at different times in my life to help me, particularly with church stuff, you know? But there's a drastic difference of, hey, what do you need help with? Or just let me know if you need anything and I'll help. It seems like a really generous blank check, and in a sense, it is. But I immediately feel, like literally feel, a burden of responsibility in that moment then, of thinking through my to-do list, all the things that are burdening me, and figuring out what I can or what I can't ask of somebody, or what would be relatively easy to communicate so that I can actually delegate it, et cetera, et cetera. Like, instead, hey, would it help you if I came early on Sundays and vacuumed and swept the building? Oh, bless the Lord, oh my soul, and forget not all his benefits. That would be much more helpful to offer a specific thing. So what if you don't know much about the situation and you don't know what to even offer? It's okay to ask them what would be meaningful for them. So maybe instead of jumping to the options, you ask first, what's the biggest burden that you're feeling right now? Or you can ask, what in your life right now seems too much? And they're maybe going to start indicating and giving you clues as to what you could ask. Oh, I'm taking care of the kids. Would it help you if I came over and just watched the kids with you? Would it help if I paid for a babysitter, if I babysat? Whatever it might be, get creative from that. If I may, when you're grieving in your moments and you're able to ask for things that you need, it really is great. You're not always going to be able to, but I just recently had a friend who was going through some grieving of his own, and he asked if I could go on a walk with him that day. It was a simple request, but he was so bold as to just go, can you go on a walk with me? I was happy to make that happen. It was really a joy to just talk and walk. And so it's not something you're always going to be able to do, but when you can, it's really good to be able to communicate to those who you can trust and ask to say, hey, would you make me a meal? Would you do this or that? Also, should make sure that as you offer help, this is my second thing I think we need to make sure we understand, that we're not accidentally communicating something hurtful in our helping. And this is what I mean. Someone who falls ill, and that's what their grief is, that they're sick or something like that. We jump in sometimes to take chores off of their plate, and that could be helpful. But if we're not careful, we could further develop a sense of helplessness, right? They may be trying to determine their place in this world given their health condition and the situation, and we might be taking so much of their responsibilities away from them that they start feeling useless to the world. And it's not what you're wanting to communicate. It's why it's important to listen and empathize and observe. And you know what? If you feel a little lost and helpless at times in helping somebody in all of this, it might be okay just to say so, because they can relate to weakness and uncertainty. They can understand not understanding. Your fumbling weakness can maybe bring comfort to their crushed weakness. And again, you don't end up making it about you by doing, I'm not saying that, or you risk inviting them to pity you for having such a challenge with caring for them. I'm definitely not saying that. But I'm just saying that you can help normalize struggle by going, I'm having such a hard time to know how to best take care of you because I care about you so much and I wish there was more I could do. That can commiserate with him a little bit. But at the end of the day, there's no formula for helping someone who's grieving. No script for what to say in every situation that will always help. No magic pill that you can offer them or that you can take to make the experience any easier. Some people just need a momentary distraction in their grieving, but some people are pained by a distraction. Some need a helpful word, others just need silence. but there is a common denominator. Jean Vanier, founder of l'Arc movement, which is a movement helping people with intellectual disabilities, says it well. He says, wounded people who have been broken by suffering and sickness ask for only one thing: a heart that loves and commits itself to them, a heart full of hope for them. So let me ask you, when you encounter people who are grieving, can you have that heart for them? Can you hope for them? That's why our faith in Jesus matters and carries so much weight, because we serve a God who is love, who demonstrated that love on a cross, who offers that love to hurting people, who empowers us to love hurting people. Jesus came and bore our burdens, empathized with our brokenness. And Jesus shows us the best response to pain isn't always clever philosophical arguments and all that, but clear demonstrations of love. So let me ask you, have you accepted that gift of Jesus' love for you? Because you really can't offer what you don't have. If you want to love with the greatest source of love, then you need to receive that love first that God has for you in your brokenness and your sin. You need to turn from that and begin a relationship with Him. And then also, if you've got a relationship with Jesus, as we leave today, I want to ask you this. What does it look like to honor Jesus' sacrifice? His love demonstrated well, His empathizing with us. What does it look like for us to be His body in this world, caring and loving for those who are grieving? May we be the kind of people that help others bear their burdens, bear their griefs, so that no one has to go through it alone.